Today, we're taking a look at GPU performance in Doom: The Dark Ages, an upcoming first-person shooter game developed by id Software, and it marks the 8th main entry into the Doom franchise and the 3rd installment into the modern series following 2020's Doom Eternal. As usual, I won't be reviewing the game, rather I'll be benchmarking the hell out of it, and no doubt a few configurations will be doomed. But before that,
I'm excited to talk to you today about Opera One R2, the latest version of the browser that packs plenty of fresh functionality. Here's some of the stuff I love about Opera. If I've got loads of tabs open, Tab Islands is an intuitive way to group tabs and save space, and with the new Tab Traces feature, Opera automatically highlights recently used tabs so that they don't get lost. Split screen is built into Opera itself now, so I can browse 2 pages simultaneously without relying on the OS. The new player provides music controls without interrupting my web browsing, plus it supports popular services I use like Spotify. It's super easy to use. There's a very impressive amount of browser customization options available through the themes feature, so you can make Opera look exactly how you like. And of course, there's the latest AI functionality built in, including the ARIA command line, a quick way to ask questions without opening a new tab. From there, you can perform actions like image generation or even image recognition, which is a useful research tool built right into the browser. Opera One R2 is a feature-rich browser that we recommend, so to download Opera now and improve your internet experience, use the link in the description below. Thanks to Opera for sponsoring this portion of the video.
Okay, so Doom: The Dark Ages is powered by the id Tech 8 game engine, which features full dynamic lighting with ray-traced global illumination and ray-traced reflections. So to play the game, your GPU will require hardware RT support. The game is also said to include path tracing, but that feature won't be added until an upcoming post-launch patch. So no path tracing FPS crippling option just yet for all you RTX 5090 owners. Now for testing, NVIDIA provided driver version 576.31 and AMD provided driver version 25.5.1, both of which are game-ready drivers that are optimized for Doom: The Dark Ages. After spending a few hours playing the game, I've decided to test a section of the game called Siege Part 1 Chapter 6, and the test starts from a checkpoint right before a reasonably large battle section, and the majority of the test takes place during the battle, so it is quite a demanding test. That being the case, if you were to monitor your frame rate in a less busy section of the game, walking down a near empty corridor for example, you can certainly expect that frame rates will be much higher than what I'm showing here. The game has half a dozen preset options, and normally I do like to test 3 to 4 of these presets at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. But for this test, we're doing just 2 presets, as there was almost no performance difference between the maximum preset labeled Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare, Ultra and High. In fact, if we look at the RTX 5080 and 9070 XT, we see that the GeForce GPU saw just a 2% performance increase when going from the Ultra Nightmare to High preset, while the 9070 XT saw a small 5% uplift. Oddly, the 9070 XT is faster than the RTX 5080 using the provided drivers, and this was an unexpected find given NVIDIA provided us early access to the game, requesting that we promote the RTX features of their GeForce 50 series, which we agreed to do because, you know, we are benchmarking RTX graphics cards here, and they do have features. Anyway, even with the medium preset, we're only looking at a further 8% boost for the Radeon GPU and just 2% for the GeForce GPU. Then using the low preset, the 9070 XT saw a further 14% boost, and the RTX 5080 a 13% boost. And this means when compared to the highest quality preset, the low preset is offering just an 18% increase in performance for the RTX 5080 and 29% for the 9070 XT. So it seems a little bit odd that we're seeing very little performance scaling via the various presets with almost no difference between the top 4 presets, a small improvement with medium and then another small improvement with low. This will be disappointing news for those of you with lower end hardware, hoping that the low and medium presets would offer solid performance gains. Now, the reasons for why we're seeing such small performance differences between the various presets becomes apparent when you take a look at the visual difference between the various presets, so let's quickly do that now. In this first example, there's almost no noticeable difference between all 6 presets, and that's not because of the YouTube compression. there just isn't much difference. Even when looking at the native presentation in-game, I couldn't spot any real differences between the top 4 presets. They all looked exactly the same to me. Even when comparing the medium and ultra nightmare presets, I couldn't really spot any differences. Maybe the distant shadow quality is slightly better on ultra nightmare, but it is very hard to tell. Then we have the low preset, and again, the overall presentation is extremely similar to ultra nightmare. The textures on the gun are ever so slightly softer, and the distant tower features reduced lighting quality, but other than that, they're very similar. This second example shows closer up details, and again, there's nearly no difference between the low and ultra nightmare presets. I've reset the game between quality settings changes to make sure the settings are all applied correctly, but it made no difference. The biggest difference I could find was in this example here when looking at the MUD. That said, the Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare Ultra, and High presets, or even the Medium preset really, they all looked much the same to me. Then with the low presets, some of the detail is lost and there are fewer reflections, but again, overall, the difference between the highest and lowest preset is extremely small. But before we move on, here's a comparison of a scene with a lot of fire and close-up rubble. Again, good luck spotting any real differences between these various quality settings. And the same goes for this scene. I'd forgive you for thinking that we've somehow messed up here and are simply showing you the exact same preset for all 6 shots, but I assure you that is not the case. For a better look, here is how the Ultra Nightmare and low presets compare side by side. There are some minor differences you can spot if you very carefully examine these images, but they are for the most part very small. Again, it's the MUD that shows the biggest difference, but the low quality presentation is hardly bad. So that being the case, I've decided to just test with the Ultra Nightmare and medium quality presets, given performance is much the same using Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare Ultra, and even High. For the test system, I'm using the Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, using the latest display drivers. So, let's get into the data. Starting with the Ultra Nightmare quality settings using native TAA, though I will look at some upscaling data soon, we see that the RTX 5090 is good for just 151 FPS on average, making it a mere 3% faster than the RTX 4090. Now, I'm not sure what's wrong with the GeForce 50 series GPUs here, but for the most part they're offering little to no performance gain over their predecessors. In fact, the RTX 5080 managed to be 8% slower than the 4080, so I have no idea what is going on here. I reached out to Nvidia, but so far I haven't heard any details about what the potential problems could be. And of course, I did clean install the GeForce driver between graphics card changes, and I tried this multiple times using stuff like DDU, but I was unable to improve the performance of the Nvidia GeForce 50 series GPUs. So either there's an issue with the driver, maybe the game needs to be patched, or the 50 series just isn't much faster than the 40 series in this particular title, and in some instances even manages to be slower. It's also interesting to note that both AMD's RDNA 3 and RDNA 4 GPUs performed exceptionally well, with the 7900 XTX and 9070 XT matching the RTX 4080 Super, coming in just 16% slower than the RTX 5090. The RX 9070 also matched the RTX 5080 and was faster than the 4070 Ti Super, while the 7900 XT matched the 5070 Ti and beat the 4070 Super. The old 6800 XT was able to just nudge out the 5060 Ti, while the 7700 XT provided similar performance with 68 FPS. Dropping below 60 FPS, we find the 3060 Ti, 4060, 6750 XT, and Arc B580. Beyond that, we're now into the mid-40s, so the experience isn't going to be great. Jumping up to 1440p with the Ultra Nightmare settings reduced the RTX 5090 to an average of 125 FPS, just a 6% increase over the 4090, and 30% faster than the 7900 XTX and 9070 XT. Meanwhile, the Radeon flagship GPUs again just nudged out the 4080 Super and RTX 5080. For around 60 FPS, the 7800 XT, 6950 XT, RTX 4070 and 5070 worked well, and you can even find the RTX 3080 with 65 FPS on average. The 7700 XT found itself situated between the 8 and 16GB versions of the 5060 Ti, and it's worth noting that 8GB of VRAM is enough for these quality settings, though as I'm going to show you soon, you can run into issues with certain quality settings even when upscaling at 1440p. Now, native 4K, you're likely going to want to enable upscaling, but for an apples to apples comparison, we're looking at native performance here. The RTX 5090 was reduced to just 82 FPS on average, which is certainly solid performance, but it means just 74 FPS for the 4090 and 56 FPS for the 9070 XT. So unless you have a 4090 or a 5090, you're looking at sub 60 FPS here without the aid of upscaling. Now, dropping down to the medium preset at 1080p, we find that most GPUs can deliver over 60 FPS, even the Arc B580 and old Radeon RX 6750 XT. That said, AMD's RX 7600 series kind of sucks here, with just 52 FPS on average, while the RTX 4060 was good for 64 FPS. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 pumped out 135 FPS on average using the medium preset, and 130 FPS for the RTX 4090. So again, the 40 and 50 series GPUs are much closer than they should be, or at least what you'd expect them to be. Another example is the RTX 5080, which somehow ended up 8% slower than the 4080, allowing the RX 9070 to match it. The old 7900 XT also matched the 5070 Ti, but the RTX 3090 was 7% faster than the 6950 XT, while the 6800 XT and RTX 3080 were neck and neck. Beyond that though, we're dropping down below 60 FPS. Finally, at 4K, using the medium settings, the RTX 5090 rendered 89 FPS, which is a mere 9% increase over the Ultra Nightmare settings. Lower end parts such as the RTX 5070 saw an 11% boost, but even so, that's a pretty weak performance gain. Typically, you'd expect at least a 40% uplift when going from the maximum quality preset to a medium preset. As a result, you're looking at just 41 FPS with the 5070, so even with upscaling, the experience isn't going to be amazing. Here's a quick look at how FSR and DLSS upscaling compares using the 9070 XT and RTX 5080. Again, the Radeon GPU is faster, delivering 11% more performance when rendering at the native resolution, and then with quality upscaling, that margin extends to 16% as the Radeon GPU becomes 40% faster and the GeForce GPU 34% faster. The margin is then reduced slightly to 15% with the balance settings, 14% with performance, and then back to 11% with the ultra performance setting. At 1440p, I recommend the quality option for both GPUs, as this provides the best balance of visuals and performance. Okay, so let's talk about 8GB GPUs in Doom The Dark Ages, namely the new 8GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti. For the most part, 8GB GPUs work just fine in this game, and you can tell the developer has put a lot of effort into optimizing the game for 8GB GPUs, which makes sense given the majority of PC gamers are still stuck with an 8GB GPU because AMD and Nvidia kind of suck, and appear to be actively trying to kill PC gaming, but I digress. Anyway, as was the case with Space Marine 2, I feel the game desperately needs a 4K texture pack, because while some of the textures, they look quite nice, a lot of them don't. They look a bit low resolution and lack detail when playing the game at higher resolutions. And I said this about Space Marine 2, a lot of people pushed back against that, but once we got the 4K texture pack, we were eventually presented with an entirely different looking game, a much better looking game that no longer worked correctly with 8GB graphics cards. Okay, so first here's a look at how the 8 and 16GB versions of the RTX 5060 Ti compare at 4K using the balanced DLSS upscaling option, and this test takes place during a large horde battle. Admittedly, the frame rate of the 16GB model isn't great, but the game does work, whereas the exact same GPU but limited to 8GB of VRAM is completely broken. But this is an extreme example used merely to help find the limits. Now, if we enable DLSS upscaling at 1440p, the 8GB 5060 Ti doesn't really receive much of a performance boost over the native performance. whereas the 16GB model becomes around 40% faster. However, when compared to the bar graph results that we just looked at, which are based on a 30-second benchmark pass, I decided to play the game for a few minutes to try and saturate the VRAM buffer. At the start of the test, the 16GB model is around 42% faster, which is a big increase, but a few minutes into the test, the VRAM buffer becomes so overwhelmed, the performance tanks completely to the point where the game becomes unplayable with just 8GB of VRAM, leading to around 82% better average frame rate performance with the 16GB model and over 2000% greater 1% lows. This difference was also seen when using the Nightmare and Ultra presets, and even some difference was seen with High, though the performance was much the same with the Medium preset, and so too were the visuals, so it is a bit of a non-issue. However, it appears to become a complete non-issue once I discovered that you can turn the texture pool size down from the default 2GB to 1.5GB, and doing so dramatically boosted the performance of the 8GB 5060 Ti at 1440p with upscaling, allowing for the same level of performance seen from the 16GB model, with no noticeable downgrade to visuals. I also couldn't spot increased texture pop-in or detail pop-in, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. The game says that increasing the texture pool size, so allocating additional VRAM, can improve performance, but I was unable to produce any evidence of this in the sections of the game that I used for testing. This texture pool size setting is important for those of you with 8GB GPUs, especially when using technology such as frame generation. I found with the default 2GB pool size that sometimes DLSS multi-frame generation just didn't work, and would often take multiple game resets to enable, and even then sometimes performance didn't end up where it should be. For example, here's an earlier test I conducted when I was first trying to enable multi-frame generation. As you can see, it's working as expected on the 16GB model, but not the 8GB model. In fact, when enabling multi-frame generation, this reduced the performance of the 8GB model. But I did find that if I went to a less demanding section of the game and then looked directly down at the ground, and then went into the menu and enabled multi-frame generation, it would sometimes work, or often it would work when doing this. It seemed as though I had to try and reduce VRAM usage before I could enable multi-frame generation on the 8GB model, and this was not an issue that I saw with the 16GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti. Now, if I drop down to the medium preset with the 1.5GB texture pool setting, multi-frame generation appeared to work perfectly on the 8GB 5060 Ti, delivering the same level of performance seen on the 16GB model. Actually, in this example, performance was slightly better on the 8GB model, though this is likely due to run-to-run variance, and I was using a higher texture pool size on the 16GB model, though that is said to improve performance at least according to the game. Anyway, based on my testing here, multi-frame generation was buggy on the 8GB model, while flawless on the 16GB version. It's also important that you reduce the texture pool size from the default 2GB down to 1.5GB with an 8GB GPU. Also, for those of you wondering, you can max out the texture pool size to 4GB when using a 16GB GPU, and this can be done so without a performance hit. Though I can't say what this actually improves, as I was unable to produce any evidence of an improvement to either the visuals or performance. So there you have it. I'd say overall Doom the Dark Ages is quite a well optimized game that plays nicely maxed out at 1440p with upscaling. Quality upscaling boosts performance by around 30 to 40%, meaning GPUs such as the 7700 XT and 5060 Ti should be able to average over 60 FPS, which I think should be considered a bare minimum for modern PC gaming. The only optimization issue here being the lack of scaling. At most, we saw a 30% FPS improvement when going from the maximum quality settings to the minimum quality settings, which is why the RX 6600 was only good for 41 FPS at native 1080p using the medium preset. The game still looks great, but you're also receiving very little in the way of additional performance. So that being the case, I'd like to see an option for those of you with older or lower end graphics cards that sacrifices more of the visuals, so parts like an RX 6600 can push over 60 FPS at 1080p. Overall, the game does look very good, and many of the effects are excellent. Explosions are particularly satisfying, But as I said earlier, the texture quality isn't always amazing, and it very much reminds me of what we first found with Space Marine 2. That is to say, the game desperately needs a 4K texture pack. At this point, it does appear as though mainstream GPUs are holding back PC gaming. Developers these days have to make a choice. Either try and fit the game inside an 8GB VRAM buffer, reducing visual quality in the process, or forget about optimizing for 8GB to push visuals to the max, hurting mainstream gamers that can only afford 8GB cards. Doom the Dark Ages isn't the first time we've seen a game that does work on 8GB cards, but suffers in other ways because of it. We saw a similar thing with Black Myth Wukong, for example. I think games like this would look considerably better without requiring more compute power to render them if 16GB was the minimum VRAM configuration. Hopefully, as was the case with Space Marine 2, we do get a high-resolution texture pack for Doom, as the results could be quite amazing. As for general stability, I did have a number of crashes when using the GeForce GPUs, namely the Blackwell models. I wouldn't say stability was terrible, but throughout my testing the game did hardlock a few times, and I had a number of crashes when using frame generation on the 8GB GeForce GPUs, though the 1.5GB texture pool option did seem to help there. On the other hand, I didn't suffer a single crash or any issues to speak of when using the Radeon GPUs. I was really pleasantly surprised by just how well the 9070 series ran the game, as well as a lot of the RDNA 3 series. It'll be interesting to see if the game receives any performance-related patches upon release. We already know path tracing will be added shortly, so that'll be something that we'll have to check out in the near future. Also, I've just received an email today from NVIDIA with a link to a new 576.40 pre-release driver, which is meant to improve GeForce 50 series performance in Doom, though NVIDIA didn't specify by how much, so I really don't know what's on offer there. The driver will be made publicly available on the 12th, but I haven't had a chance to test it just yet, because as I said, we just got it today, and I've spent the last 6 days testing this game using various hardware configurations. And as it stands, the results for everything but perhaps the GeForce 50 series should be accurate by the time the game is released. So that being the case, I've just decided to go ahead with the content, as there's a lot of information here, and again, it's unclear what this driver has to offer. NVIDIA did not specify, so again, I'll get testing straight away to try and work that out. And I will do my best to retest the GeForce 50 series as quickly as I can. Hopefully by the time this video goes live, because we're only a few hours away now, I will have run a few tests. I can pin a comment there for you and let you guys know what kind of, well, hopefully some good news for those of you with GeForce 50 series, that, you know, a part like the RTX 5080 becomes faster than the 4080, because that one's quite odd, a bit embarrassing for NVIDIA, so surely that is something they can address with a future driver update. But yeah, I'll pin a comment with that information, so scroll down and have a look at the comments, and hopefully you better find that one. But yeah, other than that, I think I'll end the video here. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe for more content. We also have the join button on Patreon if you want to become a Hardware Unboxed member. It'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So a lot of cool things there, but if you're not interested, that is also perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.